A wax nun had been trapped for 40 years, sealed inside a statue as if it were her tomb. But when the janitor struck the plaster, what tumbled out changed everything. Because inside the shell was a ledger, names of men in power, judges, politicians, businessmen, all secretly paying to hide the darkest secrets of the convent. And Mother Elena, she knew it had been found. And when Elias the janitor realized what the ledger contained, he understood the truth was bigger than murder. It could destroy an entire city's hidden corruption. But could he survive long enough to expose it? Elias Vance didn't care for the holy. He doesn't care about miracles. He cared about cash, quiet, and jobs that didn't ask questions. Therefore, the night janitor position at Our Lady of the Iron Veil Convent, tucked outside San Antonio, Texas, felt perfect. No daylight, no people. Just him, a mop, and a crumbling 19th century cathedral slowly sinking into itself. But desperation has a way of lowering standards. Elias had worked worse places: city basements, abandoned hospitals, buildings where the walls sweated. Therefore, when he stepped inside the convent that first night, he told himself the chill was just bad insulation. Still, the air felt held, like the building was listening. That's when he saw it. In the far corner of the nave stood a statue, a towering, soot-dark devotional piece. A black nun carved in prayer, her head bowed, hands folded with impossible delicacy. The stone was so detailed, Elias swore he could see pores. Tiny cracks traced her cheeks like veins. But what unsettled him most was the smell. Not dust, not wax, something faintly metallic, warm. The sisters called her the devotional. They said she'd been there longer than any of them. Elias didn't like the convent of the Sacred Heart wing, where the statue was kept. It felt less like a church and more like a sealed tomb. Therefore, when Mother Elena finally approached him, tall, rigid, eyes like weathered stone, he was already on edge. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't smile. "Your first task," she said, "is to polish the saint." The statue was encased in thick yellowed wax and sealed behind glass. Up close, Elias noticed something else. The base beneath her feet was darker than the rest, stained, as if it had absorbed something over time. "Don't use chemicals," Mother Elena warned. "She is fragile. She is our penance." Then she leaned closer. "Don't touch the base, and don't ask what she's made of." But as Elias set his cloth against the glass, he felt it, a faint heat radiating outward. Therefore, the question wasn't asterisk what asterisk the statue was. It was asterisk why it was still warm asterisk. Now let me tell you about Elena Myers. She is the custodian of Our Lady of the Iron Veil Convent, 60 years old and 60 years in service. She came into the convent when she was 20 years old, and she had been staying all these years till she reigned as the head. Mother Superior Elena wasn't frightening because she was loud. She was frightening because she never raised her voice. Therefore, when she entered a room, the sound didn't change, but the air did. She looked less like a woman and more like something preserved. Tall, skeletal, a horrifying nun look. You can just imagine. Skin stretched thin and pale, almost translucent, blue veins branching beneath it, like cracks in old marble. Her eyes sat deep in her skull, unblinking, as if blinking were a weakness she trained out of herself. And her habit, black, heavy, ancient, seemed to drink in the light around her. The novices feared her, but not in a spiritual way. They feared her the way prisoners fear a warden. Elias noticed it his second night. A young novice dropped a brass candle holder during evening prayers. It clattered once, that was all. But Mother Elena turned slowly, reached into her sleeve and produced a wooden ruler. She didn't shout, she didn't scold. She struck the girl's knuckles once, hard. Then she said calmly, "The dark cells are colder tonight." The girl didn't cry. She went pale. Later, Vance learned why. The dark cells were in the basement, old punishment rooms from the 1800s. No windows, no light, no clocks. Sisters sent there stayed as long as Mother Elena decided. Sometimes hours, sometimes days. Therefore, silence in the convent wasn't discipline. It was survival. Mother Elena had recently sealed the basement again. Elias saw her do it himself. She descended the stone stairs one evening, carrying a thick iron ring of keys, and returned alone. locking the door behind her. He noticed fresh scratches on the inside of the doorframe afterward. Fingernail marks. Recent. That same night, she summoned Elias. "No wandering," she told him, holding the keys loosely in her hand. "The convent is old. Curiosity causes accidents." Then she paused. "Janitors who enter restricted areas lose their employment." But she didn't say lose. She said disappear. Therefore, Elias understood the rule clearly. Basement doors were forbidden. Questions were forbidden. But as she turned away, one of the keys slipped free and clinked against the floor. Elias saw the tag before she picked it up. Cell 3. And suddenly the statue upstairs didn't feel like the worst thing in the building. Most people scroll past dark stories like these without subscribing, but the truth is, every video costs hours to make. I will appreciate your support of my channel. 40 years ago, the convent wasn't always this quiet. Back then, before the silence hardened into something permanent, there had been Sister Mabel. She stood out immediately, not because she tried to, but because she had no choice. Among a sea of pale faces and identical habits, Sister Mabel Payne was black, 20 years old, warm-voiced, and stubbornly alive. She sang while scrubbing floors. She laughed during chores. She checked on the sick after lights out, even when it earned her glares from the older sisters. Therefore, the novices gravitated toward her, and therefore young Elena Myers was also 20 years old at the time. But she wasn't a mother yet. Sister Mabel Payne vanished in the fall of 1978, just after the first cold snap hit San Antonio. One morning, her bed was empty, her habit neatly folded, her shoes still under the frame. Young Elena's explanation came fast. Too fast. "The girl was ungrateful," she said during morning prayer. "She ran back to the street she came from." She told other sisters at the parish, but no one knew why. But people who run don't leave things behind. Sister Mabel's rosary was still on her pillow, the wooden beads worn smooth from years of use. Her Bible remained on the shelf, pages dog-eared, margins filled with tiny handwritten prayers. Even her winter coat, necessary that year, hung untouched by the door. Therefore, the official story never sat right. One sister noticed something else. Sister Agnes, barely 20 at the time, swore she heard footsteps in the convent after midnight the night Mabel disappeared. Heavy ones. Dragging. She said she smelled wax burning long after the candles had been extinguished. When she mentioned it the next morning, Mother Elena assigned her to the infirmary. Permanently. She never spoke of it again. But the absence lingered. Beds get reassigned. Names fade. Therefore, the convent moved on. But no one ever slept comfortably in that room again. And decades later, when Elias stood before the devotional statue, staring at its darkened base and polished stone face, one thought crept in quietly. Sister Mabel didn't leave. Therefore, the real question wasn't where she went. It was what she became. Elias had learned something about working night maintenance. Buildings talked, pipes knocked, walls whispered. Therefore, when the water pressure near the chapel dropped past midnight, he didn't question it. He grabbed his wrench and headed down the narrow service corridor beside the vestry. But before he reached the pipes, he smelled it. It wasn't incense. It wasn't mold. It didn't belong in a house of prayer at all. It was cheap tobacco, sharp, dry, unmistakable. And layered beneath it, heavy and musky, was something worse. Expensive cologne. The kind worn by men who expected to be remembered. Therefore, Elias slowed his steps, every instinct screaming that this was not meant for him. The scent leaked from behind the vestry door. It was barely open. Just a crack. Enough. Elias Vance leaned in, heart pounding, knowing full well the rule. No lingering, no watching, no curiosity. Mother Superior Elena had made that clear. Janitors who saw too much didn't complain. They vanished from the schedule. Permanently. Therefore, being caught here wouldn't mean a warning. It would mean the basement. But he looked anyway. Inside, under a single bare bulb, stood Mother Elena. Not praying, not reading scripture. She held a cigarette between two pale fingers, exhaling blue smoke like it was nothing more than breath. On the table before her lay stacks of cash, real cash, thick bundles of high-denomination bills, neatly counted, methodically organized. She licked her thumb and flipped another note. Vance's stomach tightened. This wasn't petty corruption. This wasn't stolen donations or skimmed offerings. The amount on that table was wrong. Too much. The kind of money that didn't pass through parish books. The kind that came from somewhere dark and stayed hidden for a reason. Then he saw the ledger. It wasn't a church ledger. No hymns, no repairs, no charity entries. Just dates. Names replaced with symbols. And amounts that made Elias's mouth go dry. Therefore, this wasn't greed. It was a system. Elena paused. She tilted her head slightly as if listening. Elias froze. If she opened that door, there would be no explanation, no forgiveness. The dark cells weren't a rumor to him anymore. He'd seen the scratches. He'd smelled the damp air rising from below. Therefore, he eased back, inch by inch, holding his breath until the vestry door filled his vision again. That's when the cologne hit him harder. It clung to the air. Thick, persistent, the same scent he'd noticed earlier near the chapel corner, near the devotional statue. He hadn't thought much of it then, just assumed it was old wood or wax reacting to heat. But now he knew better. Later that night, as Elias Vance tightened the final pipe joint and wiped his hands clean, the smell followed him. Down the corridor, past the nave, right up to the statue's glass casing. The musky sweetness lingered there, trapped beneath the waxy heat like it had nowhere else to go. Therefore, the money wasn't just hidden in rooms. It was tied to the building itself. And if Mother Elena was being paid, then someone or something was paying her for a reason. Elias backed away slowly, pulse hammering, because whatever secret the convent was guarding wasn't holy. And now, by accident, he was part of it. If you enjoy dark stories like this one, subscribe, because more mind-chilling stories are coming up in the days. Elias Vance stayed late on a Tuesday because the water main didn't care about vows or prayers. It burst without warning, flooding the west corridor and threatening the chapel foundations. Therefore, he worked past midnight, boots soaked, tools clanking softly as he followed the sound of rushing water toward the courtyard. That's when the engine noise cut through the dark. A black sedan rolled in slow and silent, headlights off until the last second. Expensive, polished, the kind of car that didn't belong on convent grounds. Elias stepped back into the shadows without thinking. Instinct, survival, but also curiosity, the dangerous kind Mother Elena warned about. Two men got out, heavy coats despite the Texas heat. Their posture said confidence, ownership. One wore a gold ring that caught the courtyard light, a thick signet etched with a symbol Elias didn't recognize. The other spoke briefly, low and clipped, with an accent that didn't belong to San Antonio. Eastern European, maybe. Therefore, Elias remembered it. Sounds like that stick. They didn't go to the chapel. They went to the back dormitory. Elias's throat tightened. Visitors never went there. Not priests, not donors, not inspectors. Therefore, when the dormitory door opened from the inside, he felt something cold settle in his chest. Two novices stepped out, young, pale, eyes red and unfocused like they'd been crying for hours. One clutched her sleeves like they were armor. The other kept looking down, lips trembling, as if afraid eye contact would seal her fate. They weren't dressed for prayer. They were dressed to be moved. Mother Elena stood in the doorway. No blessing, no scripture. Just her skeletal hand extended, palm up. One of the men placed an envelope into it. Thick, heavy. She didn't count it. She never did. Therefore, this wasn't a first exchange. It was routine. Elias felt his pulse in his ears. If he was seen, if his shadow shifted, if his boots scraped stone, there would be no warning, no firing. He'd disappear into the dark cells. Or worse, become another name replaced by a symbol in a ledger no one was meant to read. Therefore, he didn't move. He didn't breathe. The sedan doors opened. The novices hesitated. Mother Elena leaned in and whispered something Elias couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it broke them. One sobbed openly. The other nodded, defeated. Then the men guided them into the back seat, careful but firm, like they were handling fragile property. The car drove away. The courtyard fell silent again. But the silence didn't erase the pattern Elias suddenly saw everywhere. He remembered the parents who dropped off their daughters with shaking hands and grateful smiles. The donation receipts, the reassurances. They're safe here. They're serving God. Therefore, the parents never asked questions. They trusted the walls, they trusted the habit, they trusted Mother Elena. And the convent used that trust like currency. This had happened before. Elias knew it now. The ledger Elias saw wasn't abstract. The symbols weren't prayers. They were appointments, transfers, prices. Therefore, the money wasn't hush money, it was payment. Later that night, when Elias passed the chapel, the scent hit him again. That same heavy cologne. The kind that clung to fabric, to skin. It lingered near the devotional statue, thickest at the base where the stone darkened unnaturally. He noticed something new this time. Fresh scuff marks on the floor. Shoe prints that didn't belong to sisters. Men's shoes. Therefore, the statue wasn't just a symbol. It was a marker. Elias returned to the maintenance closet and closed the door behind him, hands shaking. He thought about leaving, about calling the police, about doing the right thing. But every option ended the same way, with Mother Elena's keys, the basement door, and no one left to speak for him. He sat on an overturned bucket and stared at the wall, because now he knew the truth. The convent wasn't hiding sin, it was selling obedience. And Elias had just watched the price get paid. Elias didn't mean to find it. That's the part that still bothered him later. Therefore, he knew, deep down, that whatever happened next wasn't fate, it was consequence. The crawl space beneath the east wing was barely tall enough to kneel in. Old beams, old dust, the kind of place the convent pretended didn't exist. Elias was rerouting a corroded pipe when his knuckles brushed against something hollow. Not rot, not decay, space. He tapped again. The sound came back wrong. Therefore, he pried up the loose floorboard. What he found inside wasn't money. It wasn't bones. It was a book. A small, leather-bound diary, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The edges darkened with age, but preserved with intention. Someone had hidden this to last. Someone who knew they wouldn't be around to explain it. Elias's mouth went dry. He didn't open it right away. He just sat there in the dark, listening to the building breathe, convinced that if he moved too fast, the convent would notice. But eventually, curiosity won. It always does. The first page was dated October 12th, 1978. The handwriting was neat, calm, almost gentle. I saw the men again tonight. Elias felt his chest tighten. They came through the west gate, the black car. Young Elena says it is necessary. She calls it securing the convent's future. Young Elena. That alone made Elias's skin prickle. Therefore, he kept reading. Maggot watches from the stairs. Mother Maggot taught her everything. She says Elena has the wit for it, the hunger. She saw it early. Handed her the keys before Elena ever took her final vows. Elias swallowed hard. Maggot says God rewards sacrifice. Elena says God stays silent. I think they are both lying. His hands trembled as he turned the page. They take the girls with no families, no fathers, no one who will come looking. Elena keeps the ledger, names replaced with marks, men replaced with numbers. I memorized what I could. I hid the rest. Elias stopped breathing. I have the ledger. I have the names of the men, judges, donors, visitors who kneel on Sunday and pay on Tuesday. If this diary is found, then I failed. The next line was smeared, as if the pen had paused too long. I will go to the bishop tomorrow. That was the last entry. Elias closed the diary slowly. The crawl space felt smaller now, the air thicker. Therefore, the truth settled in with a weight that made his knees ache. Sister Mabel hadn't vanished. She'd been erased. A whistleblower inside a system designed to consume obedience. That was why the diary survived. She'd hidden it on purpose. Not as confession, but as proof. A backup. Elias wiped his hands on his coveralls, suddenly aware of how loud his breathing was. The diary wasn't just history, it was evidence. And evidence doesn't stay hidden forever. Somewhere above him, a door creaked. Elias froze. Mother Elena had keys to everything. The basement, the dark cells, the crawl spaces, if she suspected. And now Elias understood something worse. If Elena found out the diary was gone, she wouldn't ask questions. She would assume guilt. Therefore, Elias didn't leave the crawl space right away. He waited until the footsteps faded, until the convent settled back into its false sleep. Only then did he tuck the diary into his jacket and slip out through the maintenance corridor, heart pounding so hard he thought it might give him away. He considered the police. Of course he did. But then he thought about the ledger, about the names, judges, donors, men with money and reach and reputations polished clean by Sunday sermons. Therefore, going to the police wouldn't be protection. It would be a signal, a flare fired into a sky full of people invested in keeping this buried. And Elias had seen what happened to people who spoke. Sister Mabel went to the bishop. She never came back. Elias locked himself in the boiler room and read the diary again. Slower this time. Certain phrases stood out. Codes, references to storage rooms that no longer officially existed, mentions of a marker in the chapel. A place where transactions were acknowledged, even if never recorded. The devotional statue. Elias felt sick. The cologne, the warmth, the scuffed floors. Therefore, the statue wasn't symbolic. It was ceremonial. A witness. Maybe even a threat. He heard voices in the hallway and snapped the diary shut. His name wasn't spoken. Not yet. But the convent had a way of closing in once it sensed disruption. Elias knew he was in danger now. Immediate danger. If Elena discovered the diary missing, the next knock on his door wouldn't be polite. It would be final. Therefore, he made a decision that terrified him more than staying silent. He wouldn't go to the police. Not yet. He would still need to find out more truth and get enough evidence. Because Elias Vance had seen the statue. Elias had smelled the cologne. And Elias still believed there might be a way out. Vance pressed the diary against his chest, feeling its weight, its truth, its warning. Sister Mabel had tried to stop this once. She'd paid for it with her life. Therefore, the question wasn't whether the convent would kill again. It was who they would silence next, and how much time Elias had left before they realized the past had crawled back into the light. The call came just before dawn. Not an emergency, not panic, just quiet urgency. "The chapel floor is leaking," one of the sisters whispered. "Something holy." Elias almost laughed at that. Almost. Therefore, he grabbed his tools and headed toward the nave, boots echoing against stone that never seemed fully dry anymore. The closer he got to the devotional statue, the stronger the smell became. Damp, metallic, warm in a way stone had no right to be. The floor around the statue had begun to sweat. At first, it looked like condensation, thin lines seeping through the cracks between the tiles. But when Elias knelt and touched it, his fingers came away coated in something viscous, gray, sticky, too thick to be water. That's when his stomach dropped. Drains didn't back up here. They couldn't. The chapel wasn't connected to the main plumbing line. It had never been. Elias knew the blueprints by heart, old habits from old jobs. The nave sat on solid foundation stone, no waste pipes, no runoff. Therefore, a holy leak made no sense at all. But it was happening. Elias pried up the first floorboard near the statue's base. The smell intensified immediately. Not sewage, not rot alone, something processed, artificial. His flashlight beam shook as he angled it downward. The drain was choked, not with hair, not with grease, with something thick and gray. He scraped at it gently with a screwdriver. The material crumbled, coating the tool in fine powder. Industrial-grade plaster dust, the kind used for casting, mixing, preservation, and woven through it, threadbare, decaying strips of fabric, old cloth, habit cloth. Elias sat back hard, breath knocked out of him. This wasn't accidental disposal. This was engineering. He followed the pipe with his light. It didn't just pass near the statue. It ran directly into it. Bolted, anchored, integrated. The devotional wasn't placed on the chapel floor. It was fused into the building's waste system. Whatever went down that drain didn't leave the convent. It stayed. Filtered, packed, buried. Elias felt cold spread through his chest. This was bigger than he thought. He pulled up another board, then another. The further he went, the more he saw it. The deliberate rerouting. Pipes that should have led outward instead curved inward, toward the statue's base, toward the darkened stone that never quite dried. Therefore, the statue wasn't symbolic. It was functional, a terminal point. Elias stood slowly, knees weak, and looked up at the devotional's face. The carved pores, the cracks like veins, the way the stone around her feet was darker, denser, almost swollen. He remembered the warmth he'd felt through the glass, the faint vibration, like something settling. Reaction came late, too late. A dry, hollow sound escaped his throat, half laugh, half sob, as the scale of it finally hit him. Decades. 40 years at least. An entire system built not just to hide bodies, but to erase them. Reduced, broken down, mixed with plaster. Incorporated into the bones of the convent itself. No graves, no evidence. Just architecture. Elias staggered back, knocking his heel against the statue's base. The stone responded with a dull, solid thud. Not hollow, packed, dense, heavy with history. Therefore, the smell wasn't mold. It was memory. He imagined Sister Mabel, the novices, the girls whose parents believed they were safe behind these walls, believed prayer protected them. Therefore, the building wasn't just complicit. It was compounding the crime. Footsteps echoed in the distance. Elias snapped the floorboard back into place, heart hammering. If Mother Elena came in now, if she saw what he'd uncovered, there would be no pretense left. No warnings, just keys, cells, silence. He wiped his hands on his jeans, but the gray dust clung to his skin, lodged beneath his nails. Proof he couldn't scrub away. As he backed toward the exit, his eyes stayed locked on the statue, on the devotional. It didn't move. But for the first time, Elias was certain of something. This wasn't a monument to penance. It was a human. Most people scroll past stories like this and forget. But not you. You felt something. Don't just watch. Subscribe before the next secret disappears. Elias told himself he was just cleaning. That's all. Just doing the job the way it was explained to him. Therefore, when he knelt at the base of the devotional statue with a stiff brush and warm water, he forced his breathing to slow. But the dust from the drain was still under his nails. And curiosity, once it wakes up, doesn't go back to sleep. The base of the statue was darker than the rest. Not stained, compressed. Elias scrubbed slowly, watching gray residue bleed into the water. The smell rose again. Warm stone. Old cologne. Something faintly rotten hiding behind menthol. Without really deciding to, he braced his shoulder against the statue. Just to test it. It didn't budge. That alone wasn't strange. Stone was heavy. Therefore, he adjusted his stance and pushed harder. Muscles tightened. Boots slid slightly on the tile. Nothing. The statue didn't shift even a millimeter. Elias frowned. The base wasn't bolted. He'd already seen that. No brackets, no visible anchors. But the resistance felt wrong, like pushing against the ground itself, like the weight went down, not back. Then a voice spoke behind him. "You pry too much, janitor." Elias froze. He hadn't heard footsteps. No fabric, no breath. She was just there. Mother Superior Elena stood inches from him, her presence cold and sudden, like a shadow snapping into focus. He turned slowly. Her face was close, too close, her eyes unblinking, reflecting his own shock back at him. Her breath washed over his cheek. Menthol sharpness layered over something sour and dead. Therefore, he didn't pull away. He didn't dare. She smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, casually. Her hand closed around his arm. The pain came second. Her grip was iron. Fingers digging into muscle with a strength that didn't belong to a woman her age. Elias sucked in a breath as she leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Focus on the stone," she whispered, almost playful, "or you might become part of the architecture." Then she laughed. A soft sound, amused, like she'd made a joke only she understood. Elias forced a nervous smile. Just cleaning, ma'am." "I noticed how heavy it was." Elena glanced at the statue, then back at him. "Oh, that," she said lightly. "That's the weight of her sins." She released his arm. The pain lingered. Finger-shaped impressions bloomed beneath his sleeve. Therefore, Elias stayed perfectly still, heart slamming against his ribs. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't ask anything at all. Elena circled him slowly, habit brushing the floor without sound. You've been busy, she continued. Long hours, late nights, basement-adjacent places. Each word landed carefully, measured. You should be careful, she added. Accidents happen in old buildings like this. People fall. People vanish into spaces no one checks anymore. She stopped behind him again. The dark cells are still usable, she said conversationally. Cold, quiet, forgotten. A man could scream for days and only the stone would listen. That wasn't a joke. Elias nodded quickly. I understand. Elena studied him for a long moment. Therefore he felt dissected, measured, judged. Then she stepped back, her expression smoothing into something almost grandmotherly. Good, she said. Finish polishing the saint. She turned and walked away. No footsteps, no echo, just absence. Elias waited until she was gone before exhaling. His hands shook as he returned to the brush, but his eyes kept drifting to the statue, to the base, to the floor that hid pipes and dust and things that had once been people. She knew, not suspected, not guessed. She knew he was close. The threat wasn't hypothetical. It was procedural. Basement, cell, disappearance. Therefore, Elias finally understood the truth he'd been dancing around since his first night. This wasn't about secrecy anymore. It was about timing. Because Mother Elena didn't warn people unless she was deciding whether they were worth keeping. And if he made one more wrong move, the convent wouldn't fire him. It would absorb him. The next day moved slower. Mother Elena announced she would be an extended prayer after morning rites. The sisters dispersed quietly, heads bowed, routines resuming like nothing in the building was rotting from the inside out. Therefore, Elias took the silence as permission, or maybe as a countdown. He waited until the chapel was empty. The devotional loomed in the corner, unchanged, patient. The glass casing reflected his face back at him, tired, pale, eyes ringed with something close to panic. Elias slipped behind the statue where the shadows thickened and pulled a small hammer from his tool belt. Not a sledge, not anything dramatic. Just enough to know. His hand hovered for a second. Then he struck. The sound wasn't stone on stone. It was dull, dense, almost wet. A vibration ran up his arm, wrong in a way his body recognized before his mind did. The plaster resisted for a split second, then cracked with a low, suffocated thump. A large chunk broke free and hit the floor, shattering into powder. The smell followed immediately. Not dust, not age. Rot, sealed and preserved too long. Sweet, sour, and chemical, like something that had been embalmed badly and forgotten on purpose. Elias gagged, clapping a hand over his mouth as his flashlight beam jittered across the exposed patch. It wasn't wood. It wasn't wire. It was skin. Dark, shrunken, drawn tight like leathers left out in the sun. The surface was cracked and uneven, pores still faintly visible beneath the resin glaze. Thread impressions were pressed into it, rough, cross-hatched. Burlap, a sack fused to flesh by hardened resin and plaster, the fibers embedded so deeply they'd become part of it. Elias reached out without thinking, then stopped himself inches away. He could feel the resistance just by looking at it, like touching it would push back. A faint sound came from the opening. Not a voice, a settling noise, a soft internal shift, as if something inside the statue adjusted to the sudden exposure. Elias stumbled back, heart trying to claw out of his chest. This wasn't confirmation. Not yet, but it was enough. Enough to know the statue wasn't inspired by a nun. It was made from one. He stared at the devotional's bowed head, at the serene, carved face that suddenly looked less like stone and more like a mask. He didn't know how many layers were left. He didn't know how far it went. But he knew one thing with terrifying clarity. Whatever was inside that statue had been alive when this started, and Mother Elena had been praying beside it ever since. Elias didn't remember it. He reconstructed it. That mattered, because memory lies. Deduction leaves scars. He stood in the chapel, staring at the devotional's bowed head, and let the pieces line up the only way they could. The diary, the ledger, the pipes, the plaster dust. Therefore, the final night of 1978 unfolded in his mind with terrible clarity. Sister Mabel had been caught, not praying, not wandering, caught with the ledger. The diary's wording echoed back to him. I will go to the bishop tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Therefore, Elena didn't panic. Panic makes mistakes. Elena planned. Killing Mabel outright would have been sloppy. Bodies get found. Graves get questions. Therefore, Elena used the basement. The renovation supplies, the industrial plaster ordered in bulk, logged as structural preservation. Punishment disguised as maintenance. Elias pictured it. Mabel bound, wrists tight, drugged just enough to keep her weak but aware. A choice, not mercy, control. Elena would have needed her conscious, alive, because fear was part of the sentence. They would have stood her upright in the niche, the one that later became the statue's corner. Wood braces, burlap to hold shape, resin to seal. Therefore the plaster wouldn't run, it would set. Liquid plaster poured slowly. Not dumped. Poured. It would have been warm, almost comforting at first. Elias knew that much from working with it. It heats as it cures, wraps, tightens. Therefore Mabel would have thought, just for a moment, that it was stopping, that someone had changed their mind. But plaster doesn't stop. It creeps. It hardens. It steals breath by inches. The heart keeps beating long after the body realizes what's happening. Therefore the screams wouldn't have echoed. The plaster would have swallowed them, trapped them in place, preserved them. A devotional made from obedience. Elias clenched his jaw. This wasn't rage, not really. Elena's demonic fit was colder than that. Rage is fast. This took time, planning, the kind of patience you only have if you believe you're righteous. One detail still didn't fit: how no one noticed. The convent was full then, sisters everywhere. Therefore, how did no one hear? No one smell it? No one question why a renovation took place overnight? Why a niche was sealed? Why a new statue appeared without ceremony? Elias didn't have that answer yet, but the diary hinted at it. Maggot watches from the stairs. Mother Maggot, the elder, the mentor, the one who saw Elena's wit early and handed her the keys. Therefore, silence wasn't coincidence. It was enforced, shared, distributed like guilt. Elias imagined the final moments. Mabel's eyes level with Elena's. Recognition, betrayal. Understanding too late that truth wasn't protected here. It was punished. Therefore, the diary didn't end in fear. It ended in resolve. If this diary is found, then I failed. She hadn't failed. She'd just been repurposed. Elias stepped back, nausea rolling through him as the chapel lights hummed softly overhead. The devotional stood unchanged. 40 years of prayers whispered at its feet. 40 years of parents trusting these walls. 40 years of Elena kneeling beside a woman she had buried alive. Therefore, the statue wasn't just concealment. It was a warning. Tell the truth, and this is what happens to you. Elias swallowed hard. Because if he was right, and he was, then the convent didn't just erase Sister Mabel. It canonized her silence. And somewhere deep inside that plaster shell, the screams of 1978 were still locked in place, waiting for someone foolish enough or desperate enough to listen. Elias finally understood why the statue wouldn't move. It wasn't just stone. It wasn't just plaster. It was history. Decades of it. He stood alone in the chapel, staring at the devotional, and the realization settled into him slowly, painfully. Therefore, the weight wasn't structural. It was moral. The statue was heavy because it carried every sin the convent had buried instead of confessing. Mabel wasn't just a murder victim. She was a warning. This had never been about obedience alone. It was hate sharpened by greed. A system run by women who preached humility while profiting from suffering. And at the center of it all was Mother Elena, who couldn't tolerate one unbearable truth. A black woman had the moral high ground. Mabel saw it. She named it. She wrote it down. Therefore, Elena didn't simply silence her. She corrected her, took mahogany skin and erased it under layers of white plaster, turned a living conscience into a pale idol of penitence. the convent could kneel before without guilt. Whitewashed. Literally. Elias felt sick. Every prayer whispered at that statue wasn't redemption. It was participation. The convent hadn't just hidden its crimes, it had rewritten them in stone. And the weight of that lie was enough to anchor pipes, walls, and 40 years of silence. He looked at the devotional's bowed head and felt the question rise. Unavoidable now. What was he going to do? Because if the truth came out, it wouldn't stay contained. Parents would come looking, donors would disappear, names in the ledger would scramble to erase themselves. And the church would bury this place before letting it speak. But if the truth stayed sealed, the machine would keep working. More novices, more envelopes, more girls whose families believed they were safe in the house of God. Therefore, Elias understood the real consequence. This wasn't about justice versus silence. It was about timing. If he moved too slowly, Mother Elena would move first, and truth didn't leak out of this convent. It was crushed, cast, absorbed into the architecture. Elias took one last look at the devotional. Mabel had carried the weight alone once. The question now was whether he would walk away and let the stone keep swallowing history, or finally break it open and let the truth come crashing down, no matter who got buried in the collapse. Elias went back into the crawl space, knowing it might be the last quiet decision he ever made. The diary hadn't been the end. He knew that now. Mabel hadn't risked everything just to leave words behind. Words could be dismissed. Words could be doubted. Therefore, she would have hidden something heavier, something undeniable. He lifted the loose floorboard again and dug deeper. The soil beneath wasn't natural. It had been disturbed, packed down and reset with care. Elias scraped at it with his hands until his fingers struck metal. A thin lockbox, flattened with age, wrapped in oilcloth, so thick it had turned stiff. That was why it survived. Not forgotten. Protected. Mabel hadn't hidden it from time. She'd hidden it from searches, from quick inspections, from people who assumed fear erased thoroughness. Therefore, the ledger stayed buried because no one believed a black novice would outthink the system killing her. Elias forced the lock open. Inside was the ledger. Not symbolic, not coded poetry. A real book. Thick, heavy, the pages yellowed but intact. Ink pressed deep like the writer wanted it to last longer than their body. Names filled the columns, not aliases, not initials. Full names. Politicians, judges, businessmen, donors with plaques in city halls and smiles in church bulletins. Each entry marked with dates, locations, and payments disguised as donations or restoration funds. Elias's hands shook as he flipped through it. 1975, 1976, 1977. It didn't stop. The dates kept going. Through the 80s, the 90s, new names replacing old ones. Some crossed out, not removed, just marked inactive. Dead, retired, untouchable. Therefore, the operation didn't die with Mother Maggot. It evolved. The last page stopped him cold. This month, the business had never stopped. It had grown. The convent wasn't hiding a past crime. It was sustaining a present one. Therefore, Mabel hadn't just been murdered for what she knew. She'd been murdered for what she threatened to interrupt. A sound echoed above him. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Keys chimed softly. Elias snapped the ledger shut and pressed it against his chest. Heart hammering so hard it felt audible. The crawl space suddenly felt smaller than a coffin, because this time he knew something different. Mother Elena wasn't guessing anymore. She knew. She'd seen the chipped plaster, the disturbed floorboards, the way Elias no longer avoided the statue's gaze. Therefore, this wasn't surveillance, it was response. Elijah, her voice called softly from above. Calm, pleasant. You work too hard. His name from her mouth sounded wrong. There's been an accident, she continued. In the basement. Elias swallowed. Accidents were never accidents here. He tucked the ledger inside his jacket, feeling its weight drag at his shoulders like a sentence being read aloud. Therefore, the danger had escalated past threats, past warnings. This wasn't about silencing curiosity anymore. It was about erasing proof. And as the shadows shifted and the keys stopped jingling just above the crawlspace entrance, Elias understood the truth with brutal clarity. Mabel had hidden the ledger to be found, but she never planned to survive it. The question now wasn't whether Elias would escape. It was whether the truth would make it out alive, even if he didn't. Elias didn't run. That was the choice. Not brave, not heroic, just final. He stood in the chapel and waited. The devotional loomed beside him, silent and heavy, its bowed head catching the low light like it had something left to confess. Elias held the ledger in his hands, feeling its pull, its gravity. Therefore, leaving now would mean abandoning proof. And proof, once left behind, never survives this place. The doors opened without a sound. Mother Elena entered the chapel the way smoke enters a room. Slow, inevitable, already everywhere. She stopped when she saw him standing there, by the statue, by the truth. "I found Mabel," Elias said. His voice surprised him, steady, clear. For the first time, Elena's face changed. Not guilt, not fear. It twisted. Her mouth pulled tight, eyes widening just enough to strip away the human pretense. What stared back at him looked less like a woman and more like something wearing her. A demon draped in a nun's skin, finally relieved of the effort. "Mabel was a cancer," Elena spat. "A disruption." She stepped closer. "I didn't kill her," she continued calmly. "I preserved the silence." The words landed heavier than any confession. Elias felt his stomach turn, but he didn't step back. Therefore, Elena noticed. Her smile sharpened. "She wanted to be seen," Elena said. "To be right, to shame women who understood sacrifice." Her gaze flicked to the statue. "I gave her eternity instead." Elias tightened his grip on the ledger. "You buried her alive," he said. Elena laughed, a genuine sound this time, delighted. "Buried," she repeated. "No, I elevated her. Look at her, 40 years of prayers, of kneeling. She serves more now than she ever did breathing." Elias felt the moral choice press in on him then. Run and live with it, or stay and end it. Because fleeing meant the ledger would be reclaimed, destroyed, the statue resealed, the machine reset. Therefore, survival came with complicity attached. "You're not leaving," Elena said softly. "Not a threat, a statement." "I know," Elias replied. That was the moment she hesitated. Just a fraction. Because she understood something new. He wasn't afraid anymore. "You think this book saves you?" she asked, nodding at the ledger. "Every name inside it has power. Men who build cities, who decide who gets believed." She stepped closer, breath sharp with menthol and rot. "They will protect me." "Maybe," Elias said, "but not from exposure." Elena's eyes flicked to the doors, to the windows, to the building that had always kept her secrets. Therefore, Elias stayed exactly where he was. He didn't flee because leaving would make this a chase. And chases end quietly. But confrontations, real ones, leave marks. "You taught me something," Elias continued. "You don't erase truth by burying it. You just give it weight." He lifted the ledger slightly. Elena's composure cracked. Just a hairline fracture. "Enough." "You don't understand what you're standing in," she hissed. "This place doesn't let go of people." Elias glanced at the statue. "I know," he said. "That's why I stayed." Silence stretched between them, thick and electric. The chapel lights hummed. And for the first time in 40 years, Mother Elena wasn't in control of how the story ended. Because Elias hadn't come to confess. He'd come to decide whether the truth would walk out of this building, or whether it would need to be torn free from the stone, no matter what screamed when it came loose. If you believe in justice and refuse to stand with evil, comment, "I stand for justice." Elias didn't run. Not now, not after everything. But he had underestimated how far Elena would go. She moved like shadowed lightning, pulling a long, thin blade from her habit. At first glance, it looked like a tool for trimming altar candles. But the glint caught the dim light of the chapel, and Elias realized it was far more dangerous than any ritual implement. She lunged. The sound of her screeching filled the nave, ricocheting off stone walls. But Elias was ready. He ducked and rolled, barely avoiding the tip of the blade. Therefore, he grabbed the statue's base instinctively, using it as a shield and a weapon. The devotional wobbled. Elias didn't expect the floor to respond, but decades of rot, stress, and hidden plumbing had made it unstable. When their weight pressed against it together, the boards gave way. The 300-pound mass of plaster and bone groaned before it began to tilt. Therefore, the statue didn't just sway, it fell. But the fall was slow, almost deliberate. The chapel seemed to hold its breath as plaster cracked, chunks breaking free midair. Elias barely had time to sidestep before it hit the marble floor with a tremendous crash. Explosions of white powder filled the air. Shards of hardened plaster bounced like bullets. The smell, ancient resin, rot, and something faintly sweet, hit Elias in waves. Then came the body. Mabel tumbled out of the shell, preserved like an ancient pharaoh, but twisted in her final struggle. Her arms were rigid, fingers still clutching the ghost of the ledger. But she was finally free. And Elena? The fallen weight of the statue pinned her to the floor. The legs of the saint that she had created to silence Mabel now held her captive. The irony wasn't subtle. The evil woman who had built decades of silence and cruelty was immobilized by the very victim she had tried to erase. Elias stared, breathing hard. The air was thick with dust, the echoes of cracking plaster, and the smell of ancient death, but he couldn't look away. He realized something then. The floor had given way now because the system Elena had relied on, decades of secrecy, control, and fear, was finally failing. Rot, gravity, and human persistence had combined to undo her. Therefore, poetic justice wasn't a story here. It was physics. It was inevitability. Mabel's eyes, once hidden, now seemed to stare at him, or maybe at Elena. It didn't matter. The symbol of obedience and silence had become an agent of reversal. Elias stepped forward cautiously. The ledger was still clutched in Mabel's hands, the only proof of what had really happened. But the real proof was in the chapel itself. The shattered plaster, the body revealed, the evil woman pinned by her own crime. But danger wasn't entirely gone. Elena hissed, struggling beneath the weight, the blade still in her fingers. Her scream was raw and human now, but it was tempered by shock. Elias felt a surge of clarity. Therefore, he moved closer, careful, deliberate. Not to fight, but to witness the consequence of decades of cruelty. The victim had become the jailer. The oppressed had crushed the oppressor, not through strength, but through persistence, through truth. He exhaled slowly. But one question still lingered. Would the authorities ever believe this? Or would the ledger, the statue, and the chapel itself be the only witnesses left to the horror and the justice that had finally arrived? The answer didn't matter, because in that moment, Mabel was free, and Elena was not. The balance had shifted, and Elias realized he had survived not just by caution, but by understanding the weight of the truth and letting it fall. Therefore, he called 911 immediately. The police arrived 30 minutes later. Elias stayed back leaning against the chapel wall, heart still hammering, but he didn't move forward. Not yet. He wanted to see this unfold without interference, without letting fear dictate his steps. The coroner and a team of forensic specialists stepped carefully across the shattered floor. Their eyes widened at the scale of destruction. But what caught everyone off guard wasn't just the debris, it was Elena. She was screaming. Her legs crushed beneath the fallen statue. The very woman she had silenced 40 years ago had returned to enforce a reckoning. Therefore, the scene was a mixture of horror and justice, unfolding in real time. The forensic team began their grim work. Plaster chunks were peeled away slowly, methodically. Dust hung in the air like smoke. But when they uncovered Mabel's face, everyone froze. Her eyes were closed. Not in death, not yet, in agony, in dignity. Therefore, even in death, she commanded attention. Elias stepped closer, breath shallow. He felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. Every night he had swept floors, polished stone, and pretended ignorance. But now he knew the truth he had carried alone. Therefore, the emotional cost weighed on him heavier than the statue ever could. The plaster wasn't just a shell. In the city morgue, the horror intensified. Mabel hadn't been dead when the first layer was applied. Autopsy revealed plaster dust in her lungs. She had inhaled the medium of her own tomb, bound, sedated, cast alive, every breath a trap, every movement a layer cementing her into silence. But the question that lingered was institutional. Who knew? Who had turned their heads? Who had signed off on renovations, donations, ledger entries? The convent's hierarchy, the church bureaucracy, the donors with their plaques, all implicated, all silent for decades. Therefore, even after the physical evidence was revealed, the institutional guilt remained unanswered. Elias felt a shiver crawl down his spine. He realized the echo of this night wouldn't end in the chapel. Not for him, not for the city, not for the families who had trusted the convent. Mabel's agony had been prolonged, her injustice systematic, but her revelation was unstoppable. And for Elias, there would always be a cost. He had survived. He had exposed the truth. But every glance at the empty chapel, every shadowed corner, reminded him that some horrors leave a permanent imprint on the soul. Therefore, the forensic nightmare was over. But the haunting echo of 40 years, the questions unanswered, the sins unrepented, would linger forever. The ledger finally did its work. But it wasn't just paper in a crawlspace anymore. It was evidence. It was proof. It was a key that opened the doors of decades-long deception. Therefore, the FBI moved quickly. Men of influence, once untouchable, were hauled off in handcuffs. Politicians, judges, businessmen. Men who had smiled at the world while hiding the worst in its shadows. But justice wasn't polite. It was loud, messy, undeniable. The other sisters stumbled out into daylight for the first time in years. Drugged, controlled, kept in a state of fearful obedience. Many barely recognized the world beyond the convent walls. But freedom hit them like a shockwave. The air smelled of rain, of grass, of life. And for the first time, they could breathe without looking over their shoulders. The building itself didn't survive scrutiny. Therefore, inspectors condemned it. Stone, plaster, and memory, tainted with secrets too heavy to hold, would be leveled. The holy ground that generations had preyed upon was revealed for what it truly was. A pit of vice, a mausoleum for lies, a house built on blood and silence. Elias watched from the edge, ledger clutched tightly. He didn't feel triumphant. Relief, maybe. Exhaustion, certainly. But he also felt the weight of what had been revealed. 40 years of injustice had been exposed, but question lingered. How many similar houses existed, hidden behind robes, rituals, and trust? Therefore, the fall of this house wasn't just a conclusion. It was a warning. Truth once found has gravity. It pulls everything down. And sometimes, it takes the weight of a janitor to make it fall. Mabel was finally free. The sun of New Orleans hit her face for the first time in 40 years. The warmth was soft, forgiving, the kind that doesn't ask questions. Elias stood quietly at the edge of the cemetery, ledger folded in his jacket, hands still shaking from what had come before. But he didn't move closer. Respect demanded distance. Reverence demanded it. The casket was lowered into the earth. No plaster, no secrets. Just Mabel at last, the song she had sung in her chores, the laughter and light she had carried even in the shadows, seemed to echo across the graveyard. Therefore, everyone who looked on could feel her presence, even if they couldn't name it. The convent was gone, demolished, reduced to rubble. The stone and mortar, the corridors and niches that had held decades of horror were swept away. But the land remembered. Dirt and foundation, roots and soil carried something heavier than debris. It remembered every scream, every injustice, every whispered prayer of a woman who had been silenced. People who bought the lot say that sometimes on nights when snow falls softly, the ground hums. It isn't a scream, it isn't a prayer. It's a song, a melody that had been trapped for 40 years, finally breaking through stone and silence. Elias closed his eyes. He could almost hear it. Low, resonant, persistent, but beautiful, defiant. A reminder that truth, even buried, even weighed down by cruelty, has a way of finding its voice. Therefore, even though the world had tried to forget Mabel, she would not be forgotten. Not really, not ever. And somewhere in that long, suppressed vibration, Elias could feel her watching him, finally at peace. But he also knew the song carried a warning, that darkness persists where silence is welcome. Therefore, he carried the memory with him, ledger in hand, understanding that what had been revealed was rare. A glimpse of justice in a place built to hide injustice. He exhaled. The wind lifted the snow, the earth hummed again. And for the first time in 40 years, Mabel's melody was free. You've seen it all. 40 years of secrets, 40 years of silence. But what Elias and Mabel taught us isn't just about one convent, one corrupt woman, or one horrific ledger. It's about vigilance. But here's the truth. Evil thrives where people don't pay attention, where trust is blind, where rules are followed without question. Therefore, you have to watch carefully. You have to question what you're told. Because the next Mother Elena isn't a legend. She could be anywhere, hiding in plain sight, cloaked in authority, waiting for someone to look the other way. And that's the real lesson of this story. Not every house of God is sacred. Not every promise is pure. Not every person in power is innocent. But when someone sees the cracks and has the courage to act, they can topple even the heaviest statue of lies. But it takes courage, and it takes awareness. That's why you have to stay vigilant, watch closely, question everything. Therefore, if you think stories like this matter, if you want to uncover more truths hidden behind the smiles, the authority, the masks, then hit subscribe. Don't let another secret go unnoticed. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you see our next video. It's darker, it's more twisted, and it shows exactly how far people will go to hide the truth. So click to watch the next story. And remember, the walls have ears, the floors have weight, and the truth is always waiting to break free.